my name's Caitlin Robinson. I'm a member of the Geography Department at the University of Bristol, and I'm part of the Supergen Energy Networks hub. And as a geographer, I'm particularly interested in the different ways that inequality and vulnerability are created and reinforced through the energy system. So part of my role in the Supergen Energy Networks hub is thinking about the ways in which network operators and the actors in the energy system, what they can do to reduce fuel poverty and address different types of energy-related inequality. So when we think about vulnerability, we're often thinking about the different ways that people are susceptible to some kind of stressor or something that will cause them harm. And when we're thinking about the energy system, we're often thinking about the ways in which a lack of access to energy services, particularly things like heating, cooling, lighting, the ways in which not being able to access these energy systems and services might endanger somebody's health and well-being. So the way in which the grid is organised impacts on household vulnerabilities in lots of different ways. So one example of this is if households don't have access to particular types of energy through the grid. So for example, if you're a household that's in a more remote, rural part of the country and you maybe don't have access to the gas network and you're reliant on oil, that might mean that you have to spend more to access the same energy services that other households might be able to access if there's somewhere that's more connected. And there's lots of different ways in which this might become apparent. So there's lots of different types of energy vulnerabilities. You have one group of vulnerabilities, I suppose, that you might think of as related to health, particularly around the physiological need for energy. So some populations, some households will have a greater need for energy because they have a particular health condition, or perhaps they're an older person and therefore they need more energy to keep them healthy and well. You also have groups of vulnerabilities that we might think of as related to finances, so particularly for low-income households who can't access enough energy because it becomes unaffordable for them. So quite different types of vulnerabilities that we might be thinking about when we're thinking about the energy system. It often depends which stakeholders are talking about vulnerability, I think. So, for example, network operators will define vulnerability often through something called the Priority Services Register, where often you're thinking about vulnerabilities related to health or age, but also to access to energy as well. So thinking about, for example, vulnerability in the context of a hazard or having your energy supply cut off. So I think when we're talking about the prevalence of energy vulnerabilities, in recent years I think it's important to remember that energy vulnerabilities across the board have become more prevalent. So we've seen a significant increase in fuel poverty, for example, as a result of the growing cost of energy. And vulnerability is becoming something that many households are experiencing. You know, it's no longer a minority, it's something that is affecting lots of households, and they're starting to become quite concerned, for example, about the cost of energy and having enough energy in their home. And I think we can see a real rise in energy vulnerabilities in the UK context, particularly for households that are low income or maybe have a greater need for energy. Perhaps they have a health condition or a disability that means that they need to access more energy than other households, and that becomes increasingly expensive. And some real challenges around that. So there's lots of different ways that households have been supported to address energy vulnerabilities. One way that network operators tend to support vulnerable households is through something called the Priority Services Register, which means they have a kind of inventory of households who might require additional support, particularly in a sort of emergency situation like a blackout or that kind of thing. More broadly, there's lots of different ways that households receive support through specific financial measures to address energy vulnerabilities and fuel poverty. For example, thinking about things like the warm home discount, which gives certain households financial support to address high energy bills. We've also seen some measures around trying to increase the energy efficiency of people's properties so that they don't have to access as much energy because their houses are better insulated or better able to retain energy. And thinking about things like connections to the grid, there's also been efforts to try and connect fuel poor or energy vulnerable homes to the gas grid where they haven't got access to a gas connection. But I do think there's lots more that we could be doing, particularly around energy efficiency, but also thinking to the future and what's the sort of future energy networks going to look like, and how might we then tailor support to think about that future. So I think lots of communities are really engaged in energy transitions, thinking about their kind of local energy supply. So we do see these kind of community energy projects, for example, around new renewable energy sources. But I think one of the key things to remember here is that responsibility shouldn't necessarily be, or definitely shouldn't be, on communities to be addressing their own vulnerability. So we often see that households that are struggling often don't have necessarily the time to be engaging with these kind of conversations, and actually it's for a wider range of stakeholders to be thinking, how do we address vulnerability for communities? How do we make sure that some households aren't disproportionately affected by decisions that we make in the energy system, and not to necessarily put the onus on households themselves to be addressing some of these issues. So network operators are required by Ofgem, the regulator, to address vulnerability in a range of different ways. So one example that we talked about was around the priority services register and maintaining that database of potentially vulnerable households. There's also a range of different obligations for the network operators to record vulnerability, to do different things to address it, to be involved in potentially pilot programs to support fuel poor households. But I do think there's a greater role to be played potentially by network operators. They're quite a key part of the energy system, and potentially a sort of more trusted actor within the energy system, and really could play quite a key role in supporting households. So the role of network operators when it comes to supporting households, I think there is a potential for that role to be expanded, and to think about new and innovative ways that network operators could support households that are struggling with energy costs or who are vulnerable to fuel poverty. This might also be through working with other stakeholders in the energy system, perhaps local authorities as well, on pilot projects that address some of these issues of fuel poverty, but also then have other potential benefits that would benefit network operators in terms of thinking about things like energy demand and how we distribute demand across the energy grid. So political decisions obviously impact on the energy system and the extent to which households experience things like energy vulnerability, energy poverty. I think one of the things that the energy price crisis over the last couple of years has done is that it's really elevated energy and particularly household energy use onto the political and kind of public agenda, if you like. Which has been really important in making sure that households can access support in trying to deal with energy poverty. But it's also important to make sure that this issue stays there and on the political agenda. Obviously, we haven't seen the kind of falls in energy prices that we might like to see. And a lot of households are still really struggling with their energy prices, even though bills have come down slightly. So it's making sure that this doesn't just kind of become the norm, and actually we're still recognising that there's lots of households that need support who may well have got into debt, and this continues to be something that's discussed. So the Priority Services Register is a way for different actors in the energy system, including network operators, to have a record of households that might be more vulnerable to being without energy. So we often include households, for example, who have particular health conditions, maybe older persons or people with very young children, and they'll be recorded voluntarily on a register and be able to access additional support, particularly in times of crisis. It's important to remember though that this isn't additional financial support. Here we might be thinking about things like making sure that those households are prioritised. If, for example, we have a kind of a cut in energy, there's a sort of event that might mean that they can't access energy. But it's not additional financial measures to help households. So energy efficiency is a really important way of tackling all sorts of different types of inequalities in the energy system, and particularly supporting fuel-poor households. So by retrofitting properties, by increasing their energy efficiency, it means that people can use the energy that they've purchased in the most efficient way possible. It means that they get the most out of that energy that they've purchased. And it also means that it's one of the most equitable ways of addressing all sorts of different types of crisis that we talk about. So thinking about the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, the climate crisis, energy efficiency in properties is a solution to all of these. Although I would say that it's not the only solution, so this investment in energy efficiency does need to be coupled with additional financial support. It also needs to be coupled with greater ways of accessing affordable and appropriate fuel types as well. Energy efficiency can also be important, I think, from the point of view of the network itself and network operators, in that it does help to households to manage their energy demand as well, so reduce energy demand, particularly in areas in which energy demand is greatest and where there's greater strain on the energy grid. So in the future, we're going to see significant changes to our energy system as we transition to a low carbon society and a low carbon energy network. The likelihood is that this will be a much more distributed energy network in which we have a greater range of different types of fuel types, of ways in which we produce energy. And it's likely then that the energy system is going to become more complex. So households are going to need to have the kind of skills and literacy to be able to engage with this energy system in the way that is best for them. And I think also when we're thinking about the design of this new energy system is also to think about this as an opportunity to develop something that is also it's just, it's equitable, and it means that certain households aren't disadvantaged as part of that transition. So I think when we talk about vulnerability, rightly it can be critiqued for implying that people don't have agency. So it's this kind of idea that somebody's vulnerable and they have no capacity to do something about it for themselves. And actually, really when we're talking about vulnerability, we want to emphasise that it's not about a lack of agency necessarily, but often about vulnerability resulting from wider structural processes. So that might be kind of the development of the energy system or energy markets, or it might be kind of wider social or economic structures that mean a household is disadvantaged and therefore they're experiencing harm as a result of that. I think it's also important when we're talking about vulnerability to think about wider context. So we don't want to just think about a household or an individual as something or someone who is kind of operating in isolation, but actually they're part of this much broader structure and kind of society, networks, markets, that are all shaping their everyday experiences. And can often result in vulnerability at the household or individual scale. So I think when we're talking about energy vulnerability and energy poverty, we're talking about quite a multidimensional phenomenon. There's lots of different reasons, lots of different factors that might shape whether somebody's experiencing energy vulnerability or energy poverty. And often, or almost entirely, these factors have quite a unique geography. They're very grounded in place. Often your local environment or where you live really matters for whether you experience energy vulnerability or energy poverty. So for example, if we think about people who live in more remote communities and might have challenges accessing particular fuel types, we might be thinking about energy vulnerabilities as something particular to an inner city community where you have different challenges maybe related to the tenure of the property that you live in, that means that accessing affordable energy is more complex. So yeah, geography becomes really important when we're thinking about the ways in which households engage with energy and the energy system. So fuel poverty can be defined as an inability to access sufficient energy services. So when we say energy services, we mean things like heating, cooling, lighting, all of those things that are necessary for you to be healthy and well. And experiencing fuel poverty means that you can't access these energy services and therefore you're excluded from the society in which you're living in. It differs slightly from energy vulnerability, although there's, I guess, quite a lot of overlap in how we use those terms. So energy vulnerability differs from fuel poverty in that when we think about energy vulnerability, we're often thinking about those kind of wider factors that aren't necessarily related to finances and income, but still mean that you might be vulnerable to being without energy. So particularly relating to things like health or a greater need for warmth associated with your age. When we think about fuel poverty, we tend to think about the way in which kind of being on low income intersects with issues, for example, high energy prices or energy inefficiency. So as part of the Supergen Energy Networks hub, we're lucky to have a really good relationship with National Energy Action, that are a national fuel poverty charity working in across England and Wales to advocate for energy poverty to be something that's on the national agenda and trying to make sure that there's support in place for fuel poor households. They've been really integral, I think, to the work of the Supergen Energy Networks hub in the first phase, in thinking about different ways that network operators can support fuel poor households, also thinking about the ways in which kind of the regulation of the industry can be changed in order to make sure that a wider range of households are supported and there's not kind of specific mechanisms that mean certain households are disadvantaged. It's been really nice, I think, kind of collaborating with them, getting their policy expertise, because they have that real knowledge about fuel poverty, the kind of lived experience of fuel poverty as well, but then also on the more sort of specific side of thinking about regulations and how we make sure that the work of kind of more academic work around network operators and the energy system through things like the Supergen, how does that actually translate into policy and practice? I think that's a really useful perspective to have.